If you are a beginner and you're just starting out with weight training, you could practically look at weights and you will put on muscle just from looking at weights. You don't even have to lift it. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to be debunking the myth that you can't build muscle and burn fat at the same time. But before I start, if you enjoy these types of videos, be sure to smash that like button so I know to make more of these types of videos in the future. And if you're either new to the channel or haven't subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, as I will be uploading new videos every single day. Now onto the topic at hand. Can you build muscle and burn fat at the same time? Well, of course I can. And in order to answer that question, I'm going to break this video down into several topics. First, I'm going to be going through my own clients and experiences that I've seen with my own eyes over the last 16 years. I will then get into what exactly you need to do to burn fat, what you need to do to build muscle, how much protein you need. I'm going to use myself as an example when it comes to protein requirements. Then I will get into training gauges of different individuals, whether someone is deconditioned or injured. And then I will get into what your starting body fat percentage is, because based off of your starting body fat percentage, that is going to dictate how many calories you need to consume and what type of training stimulus you need in order to build muscle and burn fat. Now, when it comes to my own experience, I have seen hundreds of people over the last 16 years build muscle and burn fat. And these aren't hypothetical situations, these are actual clients of mine that I have seen with these results. And the truth is, when it comes to building muscle and burning fat, it is absolutely possible. And not only is it possible, but if you are a beginner, it's incredibly easy. If you are a beginner and you're just starting out with weight training, you could practically look at weights and you will put on muscle just from looking at weights. You don't even have to lift it. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. You can't just look at a weight and put on muscle. But I have seen many people over the last 16 years build muscle and lose fat at the same time. And I will just use a recent example. I have a client that came to me. This is a new client that I picked up about 2.5 months ago. 2.5 months ago, did his body fat percentage, and he was in the 40% range. And over the course of the first month, we ended up working out twice a week, and that was 8 workouts over the course of 4 weeks. In those 8 weeks, he lost 8.8% body fat. Not only did he lose 8.8% body fat, but he also put on some good quality muscle. And the reason he was able to put on good quality muscle and also burn fat is because he was a beginner. If you are a beginner, it's going to be incredibly easy to simultaneously put on muscle and burn fat. Now, what exactly do you need to do in order to burn fat? Well, in order to burn fat, you need to be in a calorie deficit. I've already explained this in several videos before, but if you want to burn fat, you need to be in a caloric deficit, because if you are in a caloric surplus, you are going to gain weight. In order to be in a caloric deficit, the amount of calories that you consume needs to be less than the amount of calories that you expend through your daily activities. That's going to be things like your NEAT activities, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and also your training. If you are exceeding the amount of calories that you burn through the nutrition that you consume, then you are going to gain weight. You need to be in a caloric deficit if you want to lose weight. And in terms of how much of a deficit you need to be in, this is going to be dependent on person to person based off of their starting weight and their goal. Generally speaking, if you are really heavy, you can get away with a higher deficit. If you are already close to your goal and you don't really need to burn too much fat, then the caloric deficit does not need to be as high as someone who is excessively overweight. In terms of how much weight you can expect to lose while being in a caloric deficit, it's going to come down to how many calories. There's basically 3,500 calories in 1 pound of fat. So if you are in a caloric deficit of 500 calories per day, 500 times 7 equals 3,500. So if you are in a caloric deficit of 3,500 calories over the course of a week, you will lose 1 pound of fat per week. That would be if you are in a caloric deficit of 500 calories per day. You can play around with the numbers based off of your starting weight to see whether it needs to be higher or lower based off of your goals, but that is the general rule when it comes to burning fat. Now that we know that you need to be in a caloric deficit in order to burn fat, what exactly do you need to do to build muscle? Well, in order to build muscle, 2 things are necessary. 1, you need to have an adequate amount of protein. Protein and amino acids are the building blocks of your body's muscle tissue, so you need to get an adequate amount of protein in order to induce muscle protein synthesis, which is going to allow you to build muscle. The other thing you need is some type of stimulus. That stimulus is typically in the form of weight training. It doesn't need to be in the form of weight training. You could do body weight training, you could do other types of resistance training, you could do bands, you could do cables. As long as you have some type of stimulus and you are progressively overloading with that stimulus, you are going to see results in terms of how much muscle you build. And in terms of how to build muscle, this is also going to be dependent on person to person. As I stated earlier, if you're a beginner, it's going to be really, really easy. If you're somebody who has been training for 20 years, such as myself, it's going to be a lot more difficult to put on quality muscle and burn fat at the same time, especially if you're already lean. But regardless of your training experience, you can still build muscle and burn fat. Doesn't matter what your training level is. You can be a professional athlete, you could be a beginner. Anyone can build muscle and burn fat at the same time as long as their body is not at their genetic limit for how much muscle their frame can handle. If you're not at your genetic limit, you can still build muscle and burn fat. Now, I just stated that you need an adequate amount of protein. How much protein is going to be an adequate amount? This is going to vary depending on the type of diet that you're on and also on your weight. When it comes to building muscle, the typical number that gets floated around is 1 gram of pound per body weight. So if you weigh 150 pounds, you should be consuming 150 grams of protein. This is really an oversimplification of protein requirements when it comes from person to person, because your weight is going to play a factor in how much protein you need, and also whether you are going to be in a calorie deficit or a calorie surplus is going to determine your protein requirements. Generally, your protein requirements are going to come in a range from anywhere from 0.8 grams per pound to 1.5 grams per pound. If you are in a caloric deficit, you want to be on the higher end of that range. You want to be closer to that 1.5 grams per pound of body weight of protein, because if you are in a caloric deficit, your muscle protein breakdown is going to exceed the rate of your muscle protein synthesis. So by consuming more protein than just the typical 1 gram per pound, you are going to be in a higher state of muscle protein synthesis relative to your muscle protein breakdown. However, if you are in a caloric surplus, then you can get away with the lower end of the range. You can get away with 0.8 grams because you are going to be in a more anabolic state just from consuming more calories, and you don't need to consume quite as much protein. So your muscle protein synthesis will still exceed your muscle protein breakdown if you are in a caloric surplus and you're not hitting that 1 gram per pound for body weight. Now, I'm going to use myself as an example to demonstrate protein requirements. Right now, I weigh 157 pounds. So my protein requirements would be anywhere from 125 to 235, because 157 times 0.8 is roughly 125. I think it's 125.5. And 157 times 1.5 is 235. To be exact, 235.5. So for me personally, my protein requirements would fall anywhere in the range of 125 to 235 grams of protein. How exactly is that going to look? Well, if I am trying to lose fat and build muscle at the same time, I'm going to need to consume more protein than the lower end. So that 235 range, 235 grams of protein, is going to be more ideal for me if I'm going to try to lose fat at the same time. However, if I'm in a caloric surplus, I can get away with consuming less protein. All I really need if I'm going to be in a caloric surplus is roughly 125 grams of protein, because my body's already going to be in a more anabolic state from consuming excess calories, and by being in a more anabolic state, my muscle protein synthesis is going to exceed that of my muscle protein breakdown. If I'm trying to maintain my body weight, then a general rule would be 1 gram per pound. So for me, 157 grams would be roughly what I would need to consume. For me, right now, I am trying to maintain my weight. I'm not really trying to gain or lose. So my protein requirements are roughly between 135 to 165 grams of protein. That's typically what I'll consume throughout the course of a day. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but that's roughly the average. It usually falls within that range. For you, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to come down to your training age, because I've been training for roughly 20 years. If you haven't been training for 20 years, you don't need to follow the same rules as I am. And also, regardless of how long you've been training, your body composition is going to dictate how much protein you actually need. First, I want to discuss training age. When it comes to training age, let's say you are a beginner. If you are a beginner, you can get away with consuming less protein. You don't need to consume that 1.5 grams of protein, even if you are in a caloric deficit. Because if you are in a caloric deficit, even if you're not consuming that 1.5 grams per body weight, because you are a beginner, it's going to be really easy for you to build muscle while being in a caloric deficit. You don't need excessive amounts of protein. As you become more intermediate and advanced, then you're going to need to consume more protein in order to have your muscle protein synthesis exceed that of your muscle protein breakdown. But in the beginning, it's pretty easy to get adequate amounts of protein. You don't really need to consume a ton. For professional athletes, let's say somebody who is an IFBB professional who is already super lean and has a ton of muscle, it's going to be very, very difficult to build muscle and burn fat at the same time. It's going to be very difficult, but it's not impossible. You can still do it, even if you are an IFBB pro. I've had IFBB pros come to me, I've worked on them with their nutrition and their training programs, and I've seen them build muscle and burn fat at the same time. As long as you get an adequate amount of protein and you have a training stimulus and you are progressively overloading that training stimulus, then you can build muscle and burn fat at the same time. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner, it doesn't matter if you're a professional. All you need is adequate protein and a training stimulus. If you have those two things in place and you're in a caloric restriction, you are going to see results in terms of fat loss and muscle building. Now, aside from somebody's training age, another variable is going to be whether they are deconditioned or injured. Let's say you're somebody who is a professional athlete, but you decided that for 1 year, you've trained your entire life and you don't want to train anymore. You're just going to take an entire year off. You are now considered deconditioned because you haven't been training for an entire year. So that first month or two that you get back into training, it's going to be really easy for you to build muscle and burn fat at the same time. Even though you have 20 years of experience when it comes to weightlifting, if you are deconditioned, when you become deconditioned, your muscle's going to atrophy and you are going to accumulate a little bit more fat if you don't watch what kind of calories you're consuming. So because your muscles are deconditioned and you've atrophied a little bit, to gain that muscle back, it's going to be a lot easier than the original time that you had to gain that muscle. So if you are suffering a little bit of muscle atrophy from not having worked out in a while, then when you start coming back to the gym, it's going to be really easy to build muscle and burn fat at the same time. As long as you're in a caloric restriction, you have a training stimulus, and you have an adequate amount of protein. Those are the three things that you need. Now, another variable will be somebody who is injured. If somebody who is injured, they are going to be incredibly atrophied in terms of whatever muscle area is injured. So for somebody who is injured and has lost a lot of muscle, because they lost a lot of muscle, it's going to be really easy to gain that muscle back once they start training again. I'm going to use again myself as an example. 10 years ago, this was back in 2009, so a little over 10 years ago, I ended up tearing my left pec. I believe it was February 4th, 2009. I didn't get the surgery until June 29th of 2010. And after I got my pec tear surgery and I got my pec reattached, I was in a sling for about 6 weeks. And after those 6 weeks, my left arm had shrunk down to 10 inches because it hadn't been moved or stimulated in over 6 weeks. Now, because I was coming off of an injury, I was able to put on a lot of muscle and burn a lot of fat in that first month because I was so deconditioned and I was coming off of an injury. Because I had so much atrophy in my left bicep, I was able to put on a lot of muscle in that left arm over a short period of time because I was coming off of an injury. Obviously, this is going to be different. You can't just put on a ton of muscle if you're not injured. If you already have a ton of muscle or you're near your genetic peak, it's going to be a lot more difficult, but it's still doable. But if you are coming off of an injury or you are deconditioned, it's going to be incredibly easy for you to put on large amounts of muscle in short periods of time while also losing body fat percentage. It can be done. I've seen it happen hundreds of times. If somebody tells you that it can't be done, they are lying to you. They are trying to convince you to sell you on some type of personal training package. And that is one of the main reasons why people still believe this myth, is because it's told in gym settings. Now, aside from your training age and whether or not you're deconditioned or injured, another factor is going to be your body fat percentage. Earlier, when I stated 0.8 grams to 1.5, depending on whether you're in a caloric deficit or a caloric surplus, that's going to be good if you're already at a relatively healthy weight. If you are somebody who is morbidly obese, let's say you're 500 or 600 pounds, you don't need to be consuming 1.5 grams per pound of body weight, even if you are in a caloric deficit. Because if you're 500 pounds and you're consuming 1.5 grams of protein, that means you're going to have to consume 750 grams of protein while in a caloric deficit. And that is just not true. You do not need to consume that much. So one of the things that I like to do with people that come to me that are excessively overweight is, instead of giving them that 0.8 to 1.5 range, I like to measure their body fat first and then give them a number to hit based off of their body fat percentage. So if somebody is 500 pounds and they are, let's say, 50% body fat, what I would like to do with that type of person is to give them roughly 0.8 to 1 grams per pound of lean mass. So if somebody is 500 pounds at 50% body fat, that means they have 250 pounds of lean mass. So 250 pounds of lean mass means on the high end, they should be consuming 250 grams of protein per pound of body weight. And on the low end, they should be consuming 200 grams. So anywhere from 200 to 250 if they are in a caloric deficit. That's going to be much more accurate, especially for people that are incredibly overweight. Because if you are incredibly overweight, then you don't need to be consuming that much protein because it's just going to be overkill. You just need to be in a caloric deficit and base your protein requirements based off of your lean mass, not your overall weight. However, that just applies to people that have really high body fat percentages and are really, really overweight. If you are of a normal weight, then you want to go with that 0.8 to 1.5 range. If you are trying to build muscle while being in a caloric deficit, it'll be higher on that 1.5 gram range. If you are in a surplus, it will be closer to that 0.8. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be discussing more about calorie deficits, since this is about losing fat and building muscle at the same time. So I'm not going to get too much into calorie surpluses because that's going to be for a different video. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. Since we already covered your things like your training age, protein requirements, being deconditioned or injured, and your starting body fat percentage, now I would like to answer the question, why is this myth still around? Well, the answer to this question is the exact same answer to the last myth-busting episode that I did, and that is because it is a great selling tool for personal trainers to sell you on a personal training package. If you believe that you can't build muscle and burn fat at the same time, then a personal trainer could have you sit down in front of them, and this is what it's going to look like. You sit down, let's say you tell them, oh, you know what, I want to lose a little bit of fat and I want to build a little bit of muscle. They're going to come up to you and they're going to do a whole fake periodization plan with you, and this is what it's going to look like. Oh, you want to lose fat and build muscle? Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is get you through an anatomical adaptation phase. What that means is that for 3 months, we have to prepare your body to build up some muscle. Then once we've done that, we're going to do a 3-month hypertrophy phase. Hypertrophy means that you're going to be building muscle. So in order to lose fat, the first thing we need to do is build muscle, because if you build muscle, you're going to be able to burn 50 calories for every pound, which is already a myth. We debunked that last week. You're going to be able to burn 50 extra calories from every pound that you gain. So if you put on 10 pounds of muscle, you're going to burn 1 pound of fat per week. And then once you burn that 1 pound of fat, then we can move on to a 3-month conditioning phase. In that conditioning phase, that's going to be your fat loss phase. That's going to be when you start to see changes in your shape of your body, and you're going to see all these amazing results in terms of fat loss. That is basically how it's going to go if you ever go for a fitness consultation. They use that, you can't build muscle and burn fat at the same time, to con you into some type of training program and give you some fake prescription periodization. As I stated earlier, you can build muscle and burn fat at the same time. I've seen it with clients myself, and I just seen it recently. I had a client, I told you, 2.5 months now he's been with me. The first month lost 8.8% body fat. The last month we just did a reassessment 2 weeks ago. I believe he lost 2.3 or 2.8% body fat, somewhere in that range. And not only did he lose body fat, but he put on muscle. So he can do it. He did it, you can do it, as long as you know what you're doing. If you have a good training program, your nutrition is on point, you're getting adequate amount of protein, you can burn fat and build muscle at the same time. If somebody tells you that you can't burn fat and build muscle at the same time, they are lying to you. And now that we've covered all that, I'm going to go into what exactly you need to do based off of your goals. Again, I've already covered all of this in the video, so I'm going to quickly recap it. Depending on your training age, if you are a beginner, as long as you have adequate amount of protein, aim for 1 gram per pound as a starting point. You don't need to do that overkill 1.5, because as a beginner, you can get away with just 1 gram a pound per body weight if you are in a caloric deficit. For somebody who is more advanced or intermediate or even a professional athlete, they're going to have to hit that higher range, that 1.5 grams per pound of body weight, if they're going to be in a caloric deficit. But for the average person, if you're just starting out in the gym, you could start out with 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and you will see results in terms of muscle building and fat loss as long as you are in a caloric deficit. Once you start to become more advanced, then you can start to increase your protein requirements. The next thing is going to be your body fat percentage. If you are excessively obese, let's say you're morbidly obese, 500-600 pounds, you don't need to go by that 1 gram or any of the numbers that I mentioned. Go by how much lean mass you have. If you are 500 pounds, 50%, then 250, that's going to be how much your protein requirement is going to be if you're in a caloric deficit. However, if you are closer to your goal weight, let's say your goal is to be 150 pounds and you're currently 157, like the weight that I am right now, you would not need to be in a huge caloric deficit. And because you don't need to be in a huge caloric deficit in order to lose that much fat, then you can get away with being on a little bit of the lower end of that 0.8 to 1.5 grams. So 0.8 would be great if you're in a caloric surplus, because your level of muscle protein synthesis is already going to be exceeding your level of muscle protein breakdown. However, if you are in a caloric deficit and you want to burn fat and build muscle at the same time, then you're going to want to be closer to that 1.5 range, because your level of muscle protein breakdown is going to exceed that of your muscle protein synthesis. But it's going to be dependent on person to person. Generally speaking, if you're a beginner, you can get away with less protein and you can get away with less of a caloric restriction. If you are an advanced athlete, somebody who's been training your entire life, you're going to need to up your protein a little bit. Aim for that 1.5 if you're going to be in a caloric deficit. If you follow all of the things that I just told you, you should be able to see results in terms of not only losing body fat, but also gaining good quality lean muscle. If you are in a caloric deficit and you have adequate amount of protein, those are the only two things you need to burn fat and build muscle. Again, what do you need to do to burn fat? Be in a caloric deficit. What do you need to do to build muscle? Adequate amount of protein, and you need some type of training stimulus. If you're in a caloric deficit and you have an adequate amount of protein and you have a good training stimulus, you can both burn fat and build muscle. That's what you need to do if you want to burn fat and build muscle at the same time. If you have any questions with regard to this topic, ask them down in the comment section and I will continue to make more videos on this type of topic. However, if you don't have any questions, then that covers it for today's video. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to smash that like button so I know to make more of these types of videos in the future. And if you're either new to the channel or haven't subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell as I will be uploading new videos every single day. That's it for today's video. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again tomorrow.